welcome to Tales from a Sex Store. I'm Hazel, here with my co-host Billy McWilliams and our guest, Tierney.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. How's everyone today?
Pretty good. Pre-show banter, definitely superior.
It was good. Good. Yeah, solid stuff. And Tierney, how are you?
I'm doing good. I am tired off of yet another one of Montana's Pride weekends because we have Pride season here.
Yeah.
We travel to all of the
Excellent.
separate ones, especially as performers. But I have coffee and a will to talk to you.
Right. And in about an hour, you'll be slinging orgasms.
I will be in more the ways than one.
It's exhausting.
It is, I know. The life of a performer.
So speaking of a performer,
Yes.
who are you and what do you perform?
Well, y'all introduced me as Tierney. So my name is Tierney. My pronouns are he, they, it, if you want to get really spicy, I guess.
Spicy.
Really spicy. As though that's the spiciest thing I've encountered in this world. But
we'll challenge you there.
exactly, that's what I'm saying. There is much spicier than a couple of its pronouns. So I am in my day-to-day life, I'm a trans man. I work at the store, and I'm a part of our local community here in Montana, in our local queer community. And by night, usually, I am a drag performer. So I'm a drag king. My name as a king is Rex Pistols.
Rex Pistols.
Yes, Rex Pistols.
Slay.
Bang, bang.
Yes, like the Sex Pistols.
Nice.
The punk band, if you know them, the original industry plant boy band, but alternative boy band, edgy boy band. And I'm sure someone out there is going to hate me for saying that.
You know, a little bit part of my history is I lived in England in 1976, literally 60 miles away from when punk started.
Love.
Yeah. Was I smart enough to get it? No. But still, it was a pretty cool time.
But I believe that some of it permeated. There's like a little punk living in you.
Oh, absolutely.
Just from the proximity.
Well, you know what? I grew to love it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important subculture.
Yeah, they definitely kicked down the doors at that time. Everybody was like, holy cow, what is that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot that we can learn from that when it comes to community and resistance and organizing and keeping people on board, which is important to, all of our communities, but especially drag. Yeah, absolutely.
That's one thing nice about drag is it speaks truth.
I do think that, drag does speak a lot of truth. And there's a source, and I can't exactly remember the name right now, I'll tell you later, but they say that there is this inherent overlap of drag and of camp, and that it is a lie which speaks the truth.
Right.
And that's how camp aesthetics are one of the ways that drag becomes really culturally important is through those camp aesthetics, and one of the things that makes it unique. But drag is a big, huge term, and it's debated right now. It's a heavily debated topic. It is something that a lot of people refer to very broadly. There's people who are in the culture who define it one way, and then who are in a different part of the culture who define it another way. And it's a historied, although, relatively short history, which is really fun to unpick, art form. So I'm kind of curious where you two come to the conversation when it comes to drag before I start spewing my everything.
When it comes to the podcast, I always come from the place of, I don't know anything, tell me all of it, because I want to make sure that whatever comes across is approachable for everybody. So make it a 101 class,
Great. Cool.
For me, I would say drag adjacent in the sense that Natasha came to me 15 years ago, or actually 18 years ago, and she was the one who threw the drag shows at MSU twice a year. She's the one who really created that culture. So I learned a lot from her in that situation. And also I came to the realization that in some ways it flips the sexuality 180 degrees. It's culturally normal for men to give women money for stripping. It's culturally normal in drag for women to cheer and give money to drag performers of all kinds of sexuality. And that's what's so empowering for them, how it frees them to express themselves in a sexual way, because most of the drag performances that I've begun to have women in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where I am.
Great. No, well, and that's what I was curious about, was because, I think that there are a lot of, very like kind of cultural definitions of what drag is, and I like to see the overlap in them, because if you ask someone to define what drag is, I get 1,000 answers back to me. And that's from performers, and that's from politicians and lawmakers and community leaders and whatever else. And so I really like to see like where the community's at, and you included in that, Billy. And also I like to be able then to like reflect back, okay, and here's why I define drag in the way that I do. And so some of the themes that I see in like what you were just saying there are this subversion, particularly subversion of gender roles, and
Right. Which is freeing.
It's very freeing. And that's, I think, another part of it, right? It's like this space, this social space where not only are there subversive reflections in the art that we're consuming, that we're performing, but also the space itself. One of the ways that I really like to describe one of the social functions of drag, and why I think it is so relevant today, why it was relevant in the first place, like the niche that it fills specifically for the queer community, is that it gives us a space where we are the majority, where queerness is the majority, where the hegemony is questioned, the conditions that we all live under, what is assumed, all of the norms are questioned. They're up in the air. They're queered.
Right.
And it gives us a space, you have that inversion, like you were pointing out with tipping. We say at the start of every show, particularly for the newcomers, of course, we tell them that consent is what? Wait, can I swear?
Yes.
Oh, fuck yes.
Great, cool. Okay, great. Because consent is what? It's goddamn mandatory. And we explain that is not just applying to, when you go home with someone at the end of the night, or if you find someone cute in the bathroom. Like, yes, consent is important there, and we need to reinforce that and know that. But also consent means, don't touch us when we don't ask you to. I always ask, or I try to always ask, and if I don't, call me on it. When I'm taking pictures with people, are you okay to be touched? A lot of people will just come and put their arm around me. And one of the things that I try and do to generate that consent culture off stage is, are you okay with being touched when I go for a picture with someone? And I've noticed it feels more comfortable, at least for me. And I hope that goes out to my community. But that's one of the ways that we invert it. But one of the other ways is, one of our other rules that we introduce a lot of our drag shows locally with, is don't assume anyone's sex, gender, or sexuality.
Right.
And while those are not the same thing, they do all, in our culture, feed into each other and how we perceive them.
Huge. Yeah. Gender and sexuality, way different, but also intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then people want to put it in a black and white box and say this means that. No, that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't reflect reality, actually.
Yeah, exactly. It's not black and white. It's not binary. It's not one or the other. And I think that's the really cool thing about the spaces that drag creates, is that we recognize that there is not a binary, that we can be fluid through it. What does this gender look like performed in a different way on a different body than you'd expect? How much of it is performance and how much of it is true?
Right.
And like I said earlier, the lie that tells the truth.
Right.
It allows us, though, as well, to, our takeaways from those spaces is we can reflect that back in society and say, like, okay, well, what truths out in the real world are presented as lies, right? Which truths of heteronormativity are presented as lies?
Right.
Which truths of who we can and can't be?
And questioning it is essential.
Right.
Because in the end, if you're good with somebody who's different than you, regardless of what it looks like, that lets you be the best person you can be, whatever that looks like. It frees you to be the person you want to be. And that could be anything.
Yes. And honestly, that personal liberation, I think, is really important to things like solidarity. That's why these spaces, while these are queer spaces, not everybody who is coming to a drag show is queer necessarily, but they are coming there to the space where queerness is the majority, where being able to question is the majority. And you know what? I love it when those folks walk out of there just as straight as they came in, just as cis as they came in, but they loved the show and they are opening themselves up to our culture.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they walk away. They're more centered in themselves. They understand themselves better, like you were saying, Billy. And like you said, I think it makes them better people. They expand their minds. They're happier. Maybe if they can process some of those oppressive norms.
They could be whatever they want to be.
Yeah.
And they don't have to go through that little person clock that fucks their head up.
Yeah, giving them the opportunity. What we're trying to do, I think, or what a lot of us are trying to do, is present people with the opportunity to question those lies of society, the assumptions of society, so that we can find something that actually works, that is actually true, ways that we can be human together.
Yeah. And that scares people. That
Yeah.
scares people because they're afraid of change.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does,
Yeah.
it challenges the norms.
Right.
And so like I said earlier, I think one of the common themes that I see come up whenever anyone is trying to define it is that it's subversive.
Right.
Right. It subverts our culture. It
Well,
subverts.
they're right and they're wrong at the same time.
How do you expand on that? What do
In
you
other
think about that?
words, it is subversive because it's
Mhm.
subversing the quote unquote norm, right?
Yes. Yes.
But it's also not subversive because it's inspiring to change.
Yeah, I don't
And
think subversive needs to mean like bad or anything like that.
right,
Yeah.
exactly,
Totally.
exactly.
And I think that that's one of the strengths of drag, and I think that's one of the niches it fills. But I think that it also it fills a lot of other social needs as well.
It's an outlet.
Yeah, it's an outlet. It's an outlet, like you were saying, Billy, before, where you're entering this conversation is seeing drag as self-expression too, and I think that that's really important. But for all of us here, like in our little chat, and for any of our listeners, hello listeners, I also wanted to just kind of like condensely have a little chat about like what drag is, what drag isn't, at least from the perspective that I'm approaching this conversation.
And you
So
know,
yeah, I do know. I love drag, or at least I'm trying to know. I'm continuously on a search for a more and more refined way of talking about this. And I know that I have a tendency I consume a lot of academic content about drag. So if I'm reflecting that too much in my language, please ask me questions, or
oh, nerd away.
yeah, let's chat about it if I'm being a little bit gated. But when I'm talking about drag, I'm talking about a performance art that is really specifically queer. And it's a performance art that has a lot of history and a lot of influences. And it is really similar in a lot of ways to a lot of other art forms. But I wanted to kind of point out some of those other art forms which really influence what we are talking about with drag, and distinguish them, though, because I think it's important to not conflate things. Speaking of not conflating things, though, just first off the bat, I said at the top of this episode that I myself am trans. A lot of other drag performers are also trans. Drag and being trans are not the same thing. So that is one distinction that I think that it's important to just make clear to everybody. So whereas being trans is an identity that relates to your sense of gender, and we could get into a whole other thing on gender, but I'm going to avoid nerding out in that direction. Reel me back in if I go too far down there, because I also love talking about gender. But
Samesies.
yeah, I know, right? I'm just like, okay, let's bring this back in. So while being trans is a gender identity, doing drag is an art form. And while there is an aspect to identifying as an artist, identifying as a drag performer, one is more of a vocational identity. And a vocational, I think, is not exactly the right word for that, like a work-based identity, or like what you do. But I like an artistic identity, maybe, you know? And I think that that is still like really important, and it shapes us, but it is just functionally a different type of identity than a gender identity.
So
And
can you elaborate on that?
yes, there's a difference between a gender identity and a like a performer identity.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah. So, for example, me as Tierney in my day-to-day life, I typically present as a man. Most people see me as a man. I love that. I also identify as non-binary. There's a lot into that. I sometimes think of this as like using gender as a tool, kind of like a toolbox. I'm offering people a way to interact with me, some assumptions to make about me, and then they will adjust that as they get to know me and refine it into knowing me better. So the toolbox that I present people with at first is they see man, and that is how I want them to see me. I see myself as a man, at least in part. And I also see myself as other things. I consider myself man plus. I'm the new and updated version.
The brave one.
I'm the upgrade. um, but I'm man, but I got something a little extra in there.
Man 2.0.
Exactly. And so I present myself as a man. I tell people that I'm non-binary, and there's a whole host of things about what that means to me personally. But again, I said I'm not going to only just talk about myself this episode. But that is my gender. That is a part of who I am, how I want people to see me, how I want them to read me, how I want them to expect my experience of culture. There is a difference in how, having lived some of my life as a woman, identifying as a woman, again, it gets complicated. And being seen as a woman, I think, is the functional part that I'm talking about here. There's a difference in the ways that you're going to experience the world, in the ways that you're going to experience culture. And so as a man, the assumptions that people make about my experiences are faster shorthand for me in engaging with people. I have no problems with mask women or with the idea of being seen as a woman. That wasn't what was uncomfortable to me. It was just that, yeah, I relate to men and want to be seen as one, and also something extra, non-binary. So that's me personally. That's my day-to-day life. I'm engaging with people as who I am in this gender that I present as a man, as a queer man specifically. In drag, I'm putting on more and then I'm performing it out. And so Judith Butler talks about, and here's where I get nerdy, I'm so sorry. I'll try and keep this part brief, but
I love Judith Butler. Go on.
yes, talks about gender and gender being performance. And so I'd say like gender is performance. It's a social construct. We're performing gender to each other, but that doesn't mean that gender isn't something true inside of us. But the performance part of gender is like how we're communicating it to each other. That's communicating like this deep, true part of ourselves. And then drag takes that and it goes, okay, let's put it on stage. Let's give it a name. Let's put the biggest parts forward and exaggerate and pare down some of the other parts of it, right? Like I'm also going through my life doing a ton of other things while also doing gender. When I'm on stage, when I'm doing drag, I am mostly just doing gender. I'm also like exploring other things artistically, but I'm not like also thinking about the fact that I have to eat later and that like I have to sleep. Rex doesn't have to sleep. He doesn't have to eat. He does eat on stage a lot, and girl, does he eat. But
so the goal is to express yourself in a way that conveys the big parts of your gender, in a way that conveys truth.
Yeah, you're taking, and it's not necessarily your gender, but of gender, right? You're interpreting gender artistically. You're taking this gender, and whether it is the gender that you usually perform. So that's similar to what I do. I don't exactly perform the gender that I perform off stage, that I am off stage. The gender performance that I'm doing in my off stage as a man, as a non-binary man, as a queer man, is not the exact same as like the gender that I imagine Rex to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's not exactly the same. But when a lot of people think about drag, they think about a cis man, and cis being not trans, being you identify with the gender that you were designated at birth. A cis man dressing up as a woman is what a lot of people think of as drag. Drag is a lot more than that, but that is like the most forward idea of what a lot of people think of it as. But that's to say that you're not just always amplifying your own, like the truth of what you are in your real life, but it is a truth of yourself. And it is a truth that is contextualized by gender, right? Because like drag is an art form that is contextualized by gender. So it's to kind of go back to your question, Billy, about kind of that distinction between gender identity and drag performance. Gender identity like is also is overlapping with your everyday life. It is ingrained in your life. It is inextricable from it. You are a whole entire human who has to eat and sleep and whatever when you have gender. Exactly. And fuck, if that's what, well, unless you're ace and don't want to do that, or you just don't want to do that for any other reason.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's not an inherent part of the human condition to fuck, but it is an important part of it for many people. But whereas drag is a amplified part of that, but you can't amplify everything, right? We are not becoming superhuman completely in drag. But we do have to amplify the gender to put it on stage, to make it exciting, to use it as art, right? So it's not gender as you normally see it. It's, I think, in a lot of the legal terms. And so here in Montana, we've had, multiple challenges to drag. They keep trying to ban it. And realistically, drag bans like that are also really importantly, what they're trying to do is police queer people and specifically trans people. One of the reasons why I think it's important to define drag is because the language that they use in legal drag bans is vague enough that it can and will be and has been used to keep specifically trans people out of public spaces and out of public discourse and out of places of power. In one of our cities here in Montana, a trans woman and also a drag performer did have her speech canceled at a local institution because of one of our drag bans that had been up a couple of years ago. So this is something that is actively used, and it's also something that encourages self-censoring. As trans people, it makes us question whether or not we will be accused of cross-dressing or performatively cross-dressing.
Right. Well, it's whole fear-based bigotry.
Yeah, exactly. Self-censor us out of places like teaching, right? I know people who don't want to work in schools because they're trans or they do drag and they don't want to be accused of corrupting children, like that kind of thing. And it is not sexual. It's not
I know.
perverse. And that's
I
why,
know.
again, like that's why I think it's important to, and I know you know, but I do think it is important to like continuously kind of reiterate this. And here's what we had here a few years ago in 2023 in the drag ban that was up in the legislature was their definition was a male or female performer who adopts a flamboyant or parodic, like parody, male or female persona with glamorous or exaggerated costumes and makeup, right? And so that is, I think it's a bad definition for many reasons. One, because it is so broad that it applies to Dolly Parton. And I love her. That's great. But also they're trying to ban Dolly Parton. And like, come on, guys. That's your, like, she's our girl, but you think she's your girl.
Camp can't be illegal.
Exactly. Camp can't be illegal. Gendered performance can't be illegal.
Yeah. The question is, why is that bad?
Well, we were talking earlier about subversion, right? It makes people walk out of the place going, oh, maybe I don't have to be masculine as a man. Maybe I don't have to be a man or a woman. Maybe I can like women as a woman. You know, it has people walking out of there questioning that.
Yeah, exactly. You could be whoever you want to be.
Mm-hmm. You can be whoever you want to be. You can question the norms that we are fed that keep us...
That are, in a lot of ways, very destructive.
Mm-hmm. And once you start questioning those norms, you start questioning other ones along like racial divides, along class divides,
Exactly. If they're lying about that, what else are they lying about?
Exactly. And so...
And that's what scares people.
It is exactly what scares people. Yeah.
But they can't articulate it because to them it's a black and white issue.
Mm-hmm.
And if you make it a black and white issue, you literally erase the population.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing is a lot of drag history, a lot of queer history has been erased time and time again. You know, when we talk about Nazi book burning, right? Yeah. That was documentation of queer medical history happening in Germany at the time.
Right. The pig triangle.
Yes, exactly. But like specifically the books that were burned were documentation of like gender affirming care and care for LGBTQ plus people. Like that's what was burned.
And you know, the crazy thing about it is a lot of the eugenics stuff originated in the United States.
Exactly. And you know, I think it's important to talk about like the eugenics and also like that racist history too as well.
Totally racist.
And you know, we're talking about drag. We are talking about something that is primarily and most importantly created, driven, and influenced both historically and currently by BIPOC folks, by queer and trans BIPOC folks, especially by Black folks and Black culture.
Right.
And specifically Black American culture in at least what we're experiencing here in Montana. There are drag cultures across the world. And also, I think it's important to note that I'm white. I'm Canadian. Actually, I live in the States now. I have my green card. I live here. My family is here, which also puts me in this position of actively moving to stolen native land as a white person from another country, already having been born in a colonizer identity and actively engaging in that. So that here's where I'm entering the conversation as well about this. So this is, you know, as much as I can claim my place in drag and in drag now as a drag king, as a drag performer, as a trans performer, as someone who continuously studies and learns about drag both in person and academically, I can't lay claim to that history.
You know, I appreciate is like you acknowledge your privilege.
Yes, exactly. But more importantly than acknowledging my privilege is acknowledging the history of it, right? And so when we're talking about drag, like I said before, right, we're not talking about trans identity. We're not talking about your gender identity. This is a performance outside of that.
Right.
But we're also not talking necessarily just about like cross-dressing, right?
Right.
There are many reasons why someone might want to cross-dress.
There's a lot of cross-dressing is done by heterosexual men.
Yes, exactly. And you know what? Yeah. That's something that we see in the store. That's something that we support.
Yeah, it's always it's a real pleasure when somebody comes in the store and they're like, "Oh, this is for me."
Exactly.
Like, "Oh, you look great."
And I think those are the types of people who would really benefit too from coming to our spaces, so that they can learn how to navigate that desire, that interest in a way that
Yeah.
isn't so rooted in a patriarchal system that does view women as objects,
Yeah.
right? It would be really cool to expand them. But like drag is not the same thing as fetish or kink, or
Right.
it's not the same as just like gender expression or gender nonconformity. It's
Yeah.
also not the same as like guys dressing up as women for Halloween. I know in like 2010s, I saw a bunch of that at Halloween. Every year there'd be a couple of guys and that was their
Yeah.
Halloween costume was a woman. So drag is not that.
Right.
Although I see, I think a lot of people do see that as subversive, although I'd argue it's not really, it's reinforcing.
Right.
Like specifically, guys dressing. It's not all necessarily subversive. But also, just to be fair, a lot of people do get their start in drag and with that gender exploration by dressing up as women for Halloween. So
yeah. You're painting a great world that is a lot more complex and layered in a number of different ways. How do we find that joy?
Well, and I think that drag is partially how we do that, right? I think drag is touching on this. I don't know if it's an aspect of human nature. I think then you'd also have to argue that gender is an inherent part of human nature, which maybe it is. I don't know. That's not my realm of study. Have somebody else on better suited to that. I'm sure that there's somebody who would like love to talk about that forever.
Yeah.
But I think that, whether it's human nature or whether it's just from living in such like a gender obsessed society, right? We live in a patriarchy. We live in a system that specifically has this gendered structure, this gendered hierarchy. We live in a gender obsessed culture. And that's not just queer people. That is straight people all the way. We start with gendering before you're born. And so I think...
And it goes way back to like from hunter-gatherer to farmers to agrarian to the patriarchy and primogeniture.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, like definitely you see distinctions there. And also by the Common Era, you see this like specific shift anthropologically moving from like matriarchal societies and from like earth worshipping and like fertility worshipping societies into a specifically patriarchal societies. You see this in like the Hellenic period in Greek history, which is actually, interestingly, in this enforced gender reformation in Greece around like in ancient Greece around that like turn into like the Common Era is also when you see the emergence of theater from like ritual, right? And theater classically defined from like the theater.
Right.
And because there was like this really gendered aspect, theater arguably became like a space where like a lot of men were learning, were exercising gender. There's a fantastic essay that is about this history of theater as a space for teaching men gender, kind of. I think it's either Crossing the Stage, Controversies on Cross-Dressing by Leslie Ferris or Classic Drag, The Greek Creation of Female Parts by Sue Ellen Case.
Right.
Both really cool sources on the origins of cross-dressing as performance.
Right. It reinforces gender norms and teaches gender norms, but there's also a part of it that's the subversion part of it, where you can allow expression of alternative genders / sexuality with a wink.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of like where like drag has been this trend that would have emerged at some point, because there have always been people who've wanted to explore gender, right? Who've wanted to explore gender and to subvert it. And when you give them spaces like theater, right? Like music, like being able to be a gay man who is not allowed to express his attraction to other men, but he can sing along to a woman proudly claiming her love for a man, claiming her attraction to a man. And that is allowed when you have people who are expressing themselves.
That's love.
Expressing their internal gender expression differently through showing up in a suit rather than the dress that is prescribed to them.
Right.
When you have these outlets, there are always going to be people who are going to be a little bit queer gender-wise. I think that is a part of human experience, especially in a gender-obsessed society. Drag probably would have emerged. Cross-dressing as gender exists across a ton of different cultures, whether it's in kabuki theater, whether it's in like theater as it started, whether it's in Shakespearean times, whether it's in switch dancing as part of a lot of Native American cultures, and something that is being driven right now by a lot of Two-Spirit individuals on Turtle Island.
Right.
Which also a really cool thing, anybody who is interested in performance arts, who's interested in like culture, who's interested in dance, actually should look that up. There's some really cool stuff on like short form video content. But I mean, you also see cross-dressing as performance or like gendered performance coming through in things like pantomime and things like burlesque and things like ballroom. And those are all distinct from drag, I think.
Right.
And I think they get conflated a lot. A lot of people say, oh, everybody grew up loving drag. Like you loved Robin Williams in Mrs. Doubtfire. I would argue that it's closer to pantomime, that character, Mrs. Doubtfire, is closer to a panto dame.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. But that has absolutely had an influence on drag and drag culture. But I think drag is distinct, and I think we can kind of track it, and I think it's more or less influenced by some of those. I think really obviously ballroom and burlesque have huge influences on that.
Sure. Well, vaudeville
As well, yes, yeah.
and when you're talking about the dance halls of England and camp.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, both drag and camp are coming from, at least camp, very definitively has connections to Polari, the queer, gay slang and code language that was used to navigate bans on homosexuality.
Right.
But part of how I define drag too is inspired by definitions of camp. But drag itself, the term drag being used to define or to talk about clothing, to talk about adornment, to talk about gender expression, goes back to about like the mid 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see people talking about it, notes of it. Through one of my sources, I found this old guy from, I think, Harvard made basically like a slang dictionary. And this is in like the late 1800s, and he defines drag as feminine attire worn by men. There's a Them interview with Trixie Mattel where they talk about drag being specifically defined as men in women's clothing or wearing female attire. I think one of the first places that I've seen it actually written down is in the Bolton and Park. Yeah, Bolton and Park. It is a legal case from London in the 1860s, somewhere around there. And they were being persecuted for, homosexual acts, but they were notorious. We would refer to them today probably as drag queens. They went about in their daily lives as men. They also went about in their daily lives as women. They owned huge wardrobes that they performed in as their female personas.
Mm-hmm.
And they were busted in like this like kind of sex scandal where they were being persecuted for having sex, sodomy. But the focus of the legal processing was mostly about their drag. It was just this fascination about their drag.
Right. There's always that fear that all of a sudden everybody's going to be sucking everybody's dick.
Yes. Well, but that's the thing. They weren't even so focused on the sex. They were focused on the cross-dressing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying about the larger fears of, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The larger fears of society that like, oh, this is so dangerous. Everyone's going to be having sex with each other.
Yes.
Like,
well, and I think that kind of to your point there, yeah, a lot of the fears of homosexuality are about this like fear that like, oh my God, like
that's me.
Sex acts that don't apply to me or that I'm scared of being applied to me. But I think that this is the same for gender, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
it's gender that doesn't apply to me.
Insecurity. It's like people are worried that the society is going to come down on them for being the expression they want to be. And so they supplement it and they repress it and they hate themselves.
Yeah, it makes them question themselves. It makes them question their body. It makes them experience body horror because, like, think about changing your body. Personally, to me, it feels a little bit like body horror to be in a body that like doesn't quite feel right. And when you make people imagine that, like, yeah, it probably brings up some discomfort for them.
Well, and they're so secure in who they think they are or they think they are that they refuse to see somebody who's different than them.
Exactly.
And then they make that difference something that is quote unquote bad or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then they try to justify it however.
Yeah.
And in the end, it's just insecure and pathetic.
Yeah. Well, and I agree, but, sometimes that fascination kind of pays off, though. In that case, in the Bolton Park case, I don't think they got in I don't know. I forget exactly. It's been a while since I read through it, but they got off pretty like they were not but like they managed to get somewhat out of it or something. Some of it was there. But so that was one of the first places where I can see drag being used to describe like what we're talking about as drag, although it wasn't exactly the same. It was more like they are in drag, right? So that's like describing the clothing.
And and if you think about it, that was pretty brave of them to do that back then.
Oh, absolutely. And so I think that one of the points that you can make is that drag has always also been tied to queer activists, right? Because content warning here, but like for homophobia and sexual assault and whatnot, but they did sexually assault these men to like accuse them of buggery. Like they had to like investigate them and like their genitals and whatnot.
Oh, it's totally
like,
oh yeah.
So absolutely, yeah. that is resistance, that is bravery.
That's like
and
institutional
also,
cruelty.
Mm-hmm. But I think another really good example of like where drag definitionally from its very roots is tied to activism, is tied to the protection of our communities, is where we get the term drag queen. So the first time that we see drag being defined with the drag queen, drag king, drag jester type of.
How do you define drag queen?
So we're kind of winding our way into a definition here of drag in general, but to kind of hopscotch over that a little bit. If drag is this performance of gender, drag queens typically are performing a gender that is not necessarily always feminine, but is more on the side of performing woman, performing some sort of maybe feminine. Maybe this is getting a little bit too into the weeds of my own head, but one of the ways that I like to think of what a drag queen is versus a drag king versus a drag jester, I kind of think that while gender is a performance in our day-to-day life, like we were talking about earlier, and then drag is gender amplified, I think we kind of take on performing genders. So it's not exactly a man that I'm performing, and maybe this is controversial, maybe this is a hot take, but I don't know that I'm necessarily performing man all the time. And maybe sometimes there are drag performers who are specifically performing man, but like I'm performing king. I'm performing an elevated, not exactly man, right? Because like if you saw Rex walking around in public, that is not exactly a man, right?
Right.
He's a man, but through a lens of like volume turned all the way up.
Right.
I use a visual
11.
and an audio.
Yeah, man to 11.
But and so I think similarly, like a drag queen, you could say, oh, it's someone who's performing a woman in drag, someone who's performing femininity in drag.
Did that start as a pejorative?
Drag queen? No. So actually, I was about to talk about where the term drag queen comes from. To like finish up the thought, you could also say that a drag queen is someone who is performing the performance gender of queen, someone who's performing queen, right?
Okay.
The queen gender. So I think those are a couple of different ways to think of it. But talking about where we get the term drag queen, that is largely attributed to one of the first times that we see drag, not just referring, like in the Bolton and Park case, to dress, to what you are wearing, and particularly to feminine clothing, but to the performers themselves and tying it to like the person, is William Dorsey Swan, who was a drag queen in the late 1800s. I want to say like the 1880s. And he was in Washington, D.C. He was a formerly enslaved man who was in and out of prison for his work as a queer man, as a queer activist, as a Black queer activist specifically.
Oof. So that hits everything. Slave, person of color, queer. That must have really freaked some people out.
Yeah, specifically a Black person too, right? Like,
right, all of it, yeah.
Yeah. And so what he was doing in Washington, D.C. was organizing balls, and they were drag balls, right? Where people would go in drag because that was becoming the slang at the time, right? And that slang that maybe emerged from Polari was definitely applied to the Bolton and Park case. By this time, it was referring to typically men in women's clothing, or people who were seen as men, legally seen as men, dressing in what was legally seen as women's clothing. That you have this person organizing these balls, people are coming in drag, and William Dorsey Swan herself is known as the Queen of Drag. So this is the first time that we see like this royalty aspect being introduced, specifically in the queen sense. The first recorded drag queen that I know of in the UK, I think, was Princess something. I think she is after William Dorsey Swan. I might be a little bit backwards on my history there on those dates, but I do know that there are other notable drag performers who started out with some aspect of royalty to their name, but where we largely attribute the term drag queen coming from is William Dorsey Swan, who was organizing these drag balls as a formerly enslaved queer, Black, legally man, although, we're not going to comment on this person's gender or anything like that. Our ways of talking about gender have changed significantly since then. But also someone who was regularly targeted by the police for hosting these drag balls, which were doing illegal things like cross-dressing, and he would get sold out by, his attendees, his white attendees. Amongst all of the white people doing this drag, he was often targeted, so he was also incarcerated. So talking about like, yeah, absolutely, he was going through a lot, but that's why he's one of our queer liberationist heroes to look to. Again, like there's that root in drag as a
the
queer
bravery
liberation.
to break free from all those norms that society put on you.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Freeing yourself.
Mm-hmm. He did bring this freedom to his community, his culture. And, we see similar drag balls emerging in Harlem from balls that were hosted by the Grand United Order of the Oddfellows, which was specifically in America, a Black fraternal order that was sponsored by, descended from a fraternal order rooted in the UK. And so this is, as a fraternal order, they were a society that was like a mutual benefit society. They had things like fraternal insurance. They were taking care of each other. This is also the same organization, a different branch of it, but the same organization that was like one of the fundamental things in establishing Black Wall Street in Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
And
Which got burnt down.
yes. And again, going back to the racist history of the United States. But so what they were doing in Harlem, and that was one of the first few branches there, they were hosting these annual balls, and they were called Oddfellows balls. And by the early 1900s, they were called drag balls, and also things like faggots balls. But this is where, you have this more kind of like competitive aspect and performance, like drag specific spaces. They became drag balls. And then from there, again, while these were organized by this Black fraternal order, we talked a little bit earlier mentioning how class is really intersected with drag too, and something that people are exploring through drag. A lot of the audience for these Oddfellows balls ended up being white and more upper class or middle class. And there was really interesting intersections of how the gays who could pass as upper class and also pass as straight would also be up there with them in like the upper areas, paying for the mostly poorer, mostly BIPOC, queer folks on the floor. But unfortunately, the judging standards of these balls was very Eurocentric, and notoriously, and good for her, Crystal LaBeija went and created her own damn thing, created drag houses, created like the ballroom scene as we know it, which is, that's what we're talking about when we're watching Paris is Burning. That's what we're seeing there, which is obviously hugely influential to drag and distinct from it, but hugely, hugely influential. So we see all of this stuff coming together in drag, that it has this huge history, and it has this history of having these class and racial intersections and being influenced specifically by people who are exploring gender through their own experience and amplifying it for a stage, allowing us to take away from it some sort of like questioning or subversion. And I think that what we can kind of condense that into is it is a queer performance of gender.
And in the end, it's inspirational. Aspirational and inspirational.
Those are definitely two of the functions. But to talk about what drag itself, yes, it is inspirational. It is aspirational. It does give us spaces to create community. It does touch on that historical, ancient urge for a lot of people to explore gender through theater, through pantomime, through switch dances, through other forms of gender in performance and of subversion. So it fills a lot of those functions. It gives us a space to be the majority. It allows us to question things. And it is influenced by people who have used that subversion to fight for their rights, to create those spaces. It is influenced by, the people who started Stonewall. The voice that is said to have started Stonewall is I've heard of him refer to himself as a male impersonator, because, that's also another distinction between drag and male impersonation, because he was from the early 1900s when male impersonation existed and drag was not being defined exactly in that way yet. Although contemporarily we'd think of him as a drag king, Stormy DeLavery. And so he was kind of patrolling the area around the Stonewall. He was this older drag king who had run this revue, the Jewel Box Theater. He was there. He was protecting the community. He was looking to see if, while there was a riot at Stonewall that night, they were getting busted again. He was looking to see if he needed to take care of anybody. He got hit. He got punched. Someone called him a faggot and thought he was a man and tried to throw him down. And this is a mixed Black lesbian drag king. And he said, why isn't anybody doing anything? Or why don't you guys do something? And that is the cry that is said to have started off the rebellion, the resistance. Well, the first brick was actually, Martha P. Johnson was not there on the first day. Where the first brick thing probably comes from is she was known to have carried a brick in her purse. And the urban legend that I've heard is that she had climbed up a pole, like a street lamp, and dropped it on a cop's head. So that's the first brick being thrown. And Martha P. Johnson, again, yes, drag queen, queer person, queer Black woman who was, she was one of the founders of Star. She was doing a lot of this work in her community. But what it is when I'm talking about it, what drag is, and this is for the lawmakers, this is for the people who want to start drag, this is for the people who are doing drag right now and need to define it to our family members. What I talk about when I'm talking about drag is a performance of gender, and I think you could say an exaggerated performance of gender, or a hyperficial, which is a term I like to use. It's not a real word. But like, we have superficial, right? Where it's like skin deep. Hyperficial is like something even more than that. It's obvious, right? Like there's this aspect of like, what's going on. It's the lie that tells the truth.
Mhm.
So a hyperficial, if you want to be fancy with it, if you want to use my words, or an exaggerated performance, and the performance implies that there's an audience. If gender is a social construct, then to perform an exaggerated performance of gender, we need to have a social, and the audience is the social. They are the social that we are constructing gender with when we're doing drag. So it is an exaggerated performance of gender through a queer lens. You could also say contextualized by gender. I think that there are some people who explore genderlessness through drag, but I think largely an exaggerated performance of gender or an exaggerated performance contextualized by gender through a queer lens is what drag is. I think that's what we can take from it. And it is so many other things. It overlaps with so much other art. It inspires so much, like you said. It's something that we
It's
can...
fun.
It's fun. It brings us together. It is something that has a history in radical queer liberation, radical resistance, in rebellion, in self-identification, in building solidarity, in meeting our needs together through mutual benefit, mutual aid, whether that's through houses, through fraternal
There's
orders,
expression through
Yep.
repression.
And then it also allows us to do things like locally, we have our own organizations too. I love and I will continue to tell people to go to locally in Bozeman. There is the Countship of the ISCSM. They do shows regularly throughout the year, and they also contribute to organizing things like our Bozeman Pride, which we just had a couple of weeks ago here, and other big events throughout the year. Up in Missoula, they also have the ISCSM themselves. They just helped with hosting some things, or they were just hosting some things for Missoula Pride this past weekend, which is why I'm tired. There's also locally, we have Queer Bozeman, which if you're looking for shows, if you're looking for meetups, if you're looking for queer community, they do a lot of events. They are somebody to look to as well. There's the QSAs, that's the Queer Straight Alliance at MSU. They do a lot of really good work in building community, in community education, and providing like a lily pad for people to step across as they are transitioning from school life into the queer community here. And we have a lot of really, really cool things that happen locally. I think that people should go out to. And, if you're getting to the end of June and you're like, oh no, I've not done any drag things all Pride season, fear not. Dear Montanan listeners, if you're able to get to Montana Pride in Helena, that is in August, and I should be able to tell you the date, and I'm not going to be able to. I'm so sorry. Some things that you can do if you are interested in that really cool radical queer history of drag. If you want to know what drag is, I will send Hazel some of my sources here and encourage you to look through them. Please come out and join us at Montana Pride if you can make it, or just at any of our other events. And you know what? If going out to a big, loud event is not your style, we do things like drag story hours. I love contributing to all of these organizations. We have a ton more. I'm probably forgetting more. I'm sorry, other organizations, if I've forgotten you.
We'll put the links.
Great, cool. Yeah, we'll put the links. But go out, go participate, be part of your community. If you have more questions, if you see me out, especially if you see me out in face, please come ask me about it. If there's something you wanted to clarify, if there's something more that intrigued you about this, I'm more than happy to talk more about drag. I promise I will talk your ear off. You're not getting out of it. You'll have to just run away. Just walk away. I will not be offended. I'll probably keep talking. But please come ask me about it if you want to. But yeah, go out, get engaged. Recognize that drag is political, drag is revolutionary, drag is radical, and it is important strategy.
That's what makes it so great.
It leads us to important strategies that we need right now.
Right. More joy.
Yeah. More joy, more solidarity, more ability to connect. Again, it brings us together. That's not just about joy. That's about like fundamentally who is going to help you when you lose your house? Who is going to help you when your pet dies? Who's going to help you
community
when you have a medical emergency? As queer people, we statistically don't have the same types of relationships with our families, both by being outsiders in our experiences a lot of the time and by being rejected. And also just other life things. Not everybody has a good relationship with their families. Like statistically, we are suffering from that. No one is coming to save us. We need to save ourselves. Yeah. And we can learn some of those strategies from our queer liberation heroes. And a lot of them can be found through the drag scene.
That's all amazing. Thank you so much for this, Tierney. Yeah.
Thank you. I definitely could talk for 1,000 more hours, but yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
We'll have you back on.
Yes.
Yeah, totally. That would be great. Tierney, it has been amazing to have you on. Thank you so much for this. I really look forward to having you back on to talk about it some more. It sounds like there's a lot more to cover. This has been Tales from a Sex Store. I'm Hazel, here with my co-host, Billy McWilliams, and our guest, Tierney. Happy orgasms.
Happy orgasms.
And mental
Mental
hugs.
hugs. Bye.
Listen, I'm usually better at lip syncing rather than actually having to say the words out, okay? Listen, this is